welcome back. Today I have two books that I want to talk about, both kind of in the romance vein, both ones that were just some interesting reads that I picked up. The one is Once Upon a Time from my TBR for the month, and then the other being Reader, I Married Him, which is a collection of short stories. So they're not really themed to each other necessarily, because Once More Upon a Time is like a fairy tale tropey kind of romance, and then this is, again, short stories based on Jane Eyre, which is, yeah, anyways, so they're not super related, but since they're both kind of romance, and I don't necessarily have a ton to say, but wanted to talk about them, I figured this was a convenient way to do it. So, first up, we have Once More Upon a Time. This is such an adorable little book, and I'm so glad I was able to read it, as I talked about in my TBR video. I first found out about this one as one that Murphy Napier talked about in one of her reading vlogs that she was listening to on Audible, and I was sad at the time because it was only on Audible, and I didn't know if I'd ever get a chance to read it, but it sounded really cute. Then I found out that they were doing a print version, and onto my list it went. And yay, I'm so glad that they did a print version and that I got to read it. It was super cute. Our two characters are Imelda and Ambrose, who are essentially cursed that the love that they had got magicked away by a witch, and then they think they can't get it back, and then find out that they can get it back over the course of an adventure and a journey. And this was just a delightful little romp through fairy tale tropes and just adventure stories and things like that in general too. Imelda is a play on the 12 Dancing Princesses trope. I don't know, or sorry, not trope, fairy tale. I don't know if Ambrose had a specific fairy tale. It wasn't one I was familiar with, if that was the case. But he has two brothers, and they all kind of have different value to their father, kind of his storyline, and so that's kind of where it starts off with. My favorite thing about this book, though, is the horse cloak. I don't remember for sure if it said that it had started as a cloak or if it was a horse that got turned into a cloak. But in any case, it's a talking cloak that thinks it's a horse. It's the best personality in the whole book. It just brings some fun levity and silly jokes to a lot of moments. And if you've read like Warbreaker and the talking sword that's in that, it gave me some of those vibes. So I highly recommend this. It was super short, super cute, super adorable, especially if you like plays on fairy tales. This might be a fun one for you to pick up. Next up, we have Reader, I Married Him, which, as I mentioned, is a book of short stories that are inspired by Jane Eyre. So, the thing about this one, I shouldn't be one to judge how other people's inspiration works, but a lot of these stories, I did not see the Jane Eyre in them, particularly starting this and reading the very first story in this book, which is called My Mother's Wedding, where essentially the daughter ends up marrying the man that her mom was going to marry. Very strange. But yeah, we start with this story, and I'm like, what is this? How is this Jane Eyre? And I was really unsure if I wanted to keep reading just from that story, but then it's like, but they are a collection of stories, so there's going to be multiple authors, there's going to be different stories, they're all hopefully not going to be like that. And I'm glad I did read through it, because there were a few favorites that I had in here. There were a couple others that I didn't super get along with, namely the Grace Poole, her testimony one, and the Reader, I Married Her one, which were both like directly in the world of Jane Eyre. The Grace Poole one being Grace Poole telling her story, but in kind of a fan fiction-y way, because the writer decided that Adele was actually Grace Poole's daughter, and they were pretending that she was that French mistress's child and stuff. And so that was weird, and I didn't like that one. And then the Reader, I Married Her one was told from Edward's perspective, and he was basically not in love with Jane, and I was like, did you even like the book Jane Eyre? Why are you writing this weird fan fiction where he like hates her? I hate this. So I didn't like that one either. And there were a few others that were not my favorites that I more skimmed than like fully dived into reading, but I did have a few favorites in here as well. the ones that I've got listed written down, if you're curious, is Dangerous Dog. This was with like a college student who ends up meeting a dog, and she kind of befriends the dog in a way similar to how Jane befriends Edward, I feel like, because the dog starts out all gruff and grumpy and trying to bite people and stuff because he was being agitated by some other people, but you know, it starts out as that kind of dog, and then Jane comes along and talks to it nicely and treats it well, and then it's a good dog, and that's kind of like how Edward's character comes across. I think technically that one also like directly referenced Jane Eyre because it talked about her reading the book and stuff, but that's okay. You can have like direct references in it and I'll still not mind it depending on the execution, and that one I thought was pretty nice. Next, I have The Migrating Bird, which was probably my most favorite on here. It took place in Turkey, and it featured a lot of Muslim, I believe, traditions, which I'm not super familiar with, so just getting that kind of background was fun. And then the college setting I thought was really fun, and I felt like I could feel the Jane Eyre inspiration in it. It was more like Jane with a cousin, I think, that she finds after she leaves Thornfield that like proposes to her and wants her to marry him and stuff, and it kind of had those vibes, but like a gender swapped thing, because the guy is the one who's like, no, I don't want this relationship, but I liked that one enough that I've put on hold that author's books at the library so that I can read more of them. Here, let me give you their name. Elif Shafak, if you happen to want to read them as well, because I really like that one. Like I said, that was probably my favorite in the whole thing. Then I also really liked Dorset Gap, which again featured like college-age kids who had like a drunken night out, and then they're going off and exploring through the English countryside and end up in this place called Dorset Gap, and it was a nice, lovely little one. It had like character nods in that she was Jean and he was Ed, and I think Jane Eyre was one of her favorite books. So it got referenced fairly directly too, but I loved it as a play on their names too. As a, here's one of our references to the original story. I like that kind of inspirational referencing a lot. And then the next one is the China, or maybe China, from Buenos Aires. This one featured a Brazilian Korean character who ended up moving to New York and kind of went through her story. And that was, again, just kind of one of those interesting perspectives that I hadn't really seen in a book or a story before, and I liked the vibes and the perspective that gave to it, and I felt like this one had pretty good Jane Eyre vibes too, a little more of the abstract kind of will they, won't they sort of romance. The ending is a little ambiguous, which was really fun, but that was a good one too. And then the last one on here that I've got listed as a favorite is the Orphan Exchange, and this one was kind of like a modern retelling of Jane Eyre. So the Jane goes to an orphanage, she meets a Helen, they're friends, and then Helen seems to have died, and then she ends up having been used in like some scientific experiments, which is part of where the modern stuff comes in. There's like a war going on and things too. And then Helen and Jane meet up again, and then they have a romance, which not always my cup of tea, but you know, a nice enough way to do it. I liked the execution of it. I thought it was a sweet little story. So yeah, that is what I have to say about Reader, I Married Him. I think part of my issue with this, especially with like the stories that I didn't see any inspiration of Jane Eyre in, and that I just had some of that trouble reading, was that I was really hoping after reading The Love Hypothesis, which has all the Raylo vibes and inspiration, that more of the stories would be that kind of thing where I could see the direct roots, and a lot of my favorites I think had those direct roots, kind of like I talked about, but the ones that I didn't like, I couldn't find those roots, and that's why I had a harder time with it. But if you're looking for a short story collection, it might be of interest if you like Jane Eyre, because there are at least some Jane Eyre vibes within this book too. But yeah, I think that's all I've got for now. But if you happen to have read either of these or have recommendations based on either of these, anything like that, feel free to share down below. But I think that's all I've got for now. This is the Umlaut Harper signing out.